Welcome to the Get Real About Safety podcast. In our podcast, we discuss the new view of safety, what works and what doesn't work, to break down old paradigms and help you improve safety performance in your organization. Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Pam, and we appreciate you listening. Please share and subscribe and tell others about this podcast. You can find us on most podcast platforms and also on YouTube. So good morning and happy Friday, Nicole.
Good morning, Pam.
Nice to have you back with us here today. And before we get started, how are you doing? Anything new and exciting in your life?
We're doing well. Work continues and construction continues, and we're getting used to the new normal of implementing COVID protection and prevention measures on our sites. So it's becoming a lot more routine.
So no sign of that backing off at any time here for a while anyway, the precautions?
So yet, I think it's going to take quite a few more months before we really see the evidence that we want to see to be able to back off of those measures.
Well, Nicole, I know you did a introduction to yourself on a previous podcast, but let's go ahead and do that again for me, if you would. Tell everyone who you are and who you work for, and a little bit about yourself.
I'm Nicole Ivers, and I work for Batson-Cook Construction here in Atlanta. I'm the HSE Director for our Health, Safety, and Environmental Department. And I'm originally from Michigan, moved down here many years ago, did a stint of quite a few years in the Middle East, working internationally, and now I'm back working in construction here. We focus mainly on commercial, healthcare, and wood frame construction.
And you had not been on board with your current company for long when, 6 months or so when the COVID situation came and hit. So it's been a little bit of rocky road. But you've been doing some really great work over there, and it's encouraging to see. And I know that we've talked about the importance of reporting and sometimes the struggles we face about that. One of Todd Conklin's quotes, and I probably butcher it up, and other people have said something similar, but something to the effect that information is the lifeblood of our safety culture. So if we don't know, we can't fix it, right? So why do you think reporting is so important, and why do you think we have problems getting information?
I think there's a couple different answers in that one, but I think first of all, when we think of reporting, we think of reporting incidents. And even though we're sometimes struggling still to get that kind of data reported, there's this whole range of safety related data and metrics that we want to be able to collect, we want to be able to measure. And I think we've struggled in the safety industry of getting that data and doing a good job of measuring it and evaluating it and assessing it to make business decisions. Just like with any other data that you collect in a business, your financial data,
sure,
scheduling data, safety data is just as important, if not even more important, if you look at the fact that this is what can help protect people's lives and well-being. So I think that there's a huge issue behind the idea of safety data in the first place. And so there's a lot of different ways that we need to approach this. And one of the questions, the big question, is why aren't we getting the data reported to us in the first place?
Right. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's definitely not a new question. I think that we've struggled with this, and and we haven't really been able to overcome the real root cause of this. Is part of it, I think, is just human behavior. It doesn't matter what field that you're in. Nobody wants to give what is perceived as bad news or negative news to anybody. So I think that just human nature, you have
That's true.
A reluctance to readily report that, especially if you think that you can fix it or make it a little bit easier to hear. So I think that that's part of the deep root cause. But also we have just this old culture around safety reporting that we're trying to overcome. And we have people that have been working in these fields, not just construction, but in industry as well, for years and years and years, and they have either not ever been requested or required to report it in the first place. And they've possibly even been encouraged and rewarded for slipping something under the rug or keeping it on the down low, or most importantly, keeping it from the safety people.
Yes, and so I think that ties in somewhat to the culture of communicate or lack of communication that we've had, particularly in construction, but I see it in other industries as well, where the communication style between supervision and workers is generally not one in which workers are ready and willing to tell them something that they may not want to hear. And so that requires a different approach. And you have been using that different approach and letting people know that there's not going to be punishment for reporting, but how important it is to know the answer to that. And yet you still have that resistance. How do you think you can go about breaking down some of those barriers?
I think we've done a few different things to try and make it as easy and painless as possible for people to report. So we have tried to educate everybody. It's something that we talk about on a regular basis whenever we get the opportunity, is how important this is, and educating people on how we use this data and how this information helps them. So you have to be able to take that data and then turn around and show some kind of response or change or improvement to show that we're doing something with this, that we're listening to them.
Exactly, and that's something that I've seen over the years, where I've had workers tell me that, in fact, is, well, you have this issue and that you've told me about, and why haven't you told anybody from management? Well, because I told them about something 6 months ago and they've never fixed it, so what's the point? So that making sure that, and a lot of times I think that it's not that management didn't fix it, it's that the fix may not be happening right now, and there may be plans to do the fix or workarounds for the fix. And where our failure is to go back to the worker and tell them, first of all, thank you for telling us about this, and here's what we're doing, and it may not be, we can't replace that piece of equipment without doing a capital expenditure request or whatever, but in the meantime, here's what we want to do to protect you. But no information means to the worker they don't care.
True, and no response or no reaction is just as bad as the wrong reaction.
That's right.
So
that's right.
A bigger part of that is helping to train and coach people on how to react to the news of an incident, an injury, or something that just was a significant non-injury event. So coaching them on how they receive that information and how to give feedback and support to that superintendent or project manager that's making the report, and making sure that they understand that they have the time and the resources to truly look into this. The worst reaction you can have is anger,
yes,
or name calling, or something like, okay, fine, when do we start back up?
Right.
And that, even though that may not be something that they actually mean, they're not saying don't investigate, but by saying how quickly can we get started again, it's that subliminal message that's the most important thing, is just getting past this.
And I think that they just a lot of times haven't been taught. Some our management folks haven't been taught how to go about talking. For example, encourage folks to actually thank people for reporting. Or even, and I think you've done some of this in the past. We have, and it's been problematic. We have rewarded not reporting, or we have created reward structures that actually reward workers for not reporting. So, what do you think about actually rewarding people for reporting?
Yeah, well, I think that's the whole shift in reward and recognition programs in general, and making sure that we're very careful about how we reward and how the behaviors will follow that. So obviously we know in safety now we really don't want to reward and emphasize on lost time, the number of hours without a lost time injury or injuries, because that really does drive an underreporting. So we really want to recognize people on actual tangible behaviors, which increases your baseline behavior, and you can continue to drive that up with a balance of reward and recognition for the right behaviors.
Absolutely. Instead of the reward for not having an accident, right? You talked about the data and the importance of having that data, which is somewhat ironic that, again, we use data so intensely in all areas of the organization, with the exception of safety. Or if we are tracking data, often it's only the, I can't think of a polite way to say what I'm thinking about, the recordable incident rate, right? There's better data to measure. Yes, we measure that for OSHA record keeping purposes, but what are some of the other data measurements that you've been using or think about using?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of things that you can measure, and one of the most difficult things is how we gather that information. And when you're trying to measure how much somebody values safety or the ownership of safety, it's a very gray thing to try and measure, which is why we really haven't measured. And it's a lot based on somebody's judgment. One person may think so-and-so is a real safety champion, but we know that by certain actions he's not actually doing that or displaying it. So a lot of the metrics that we want to focus reporting on is training and completion of training. We call them blue vest walks, but some kind of senior management observation walk. And
yes,
while you can't necessarily measure the quality of it right off the bat, at least performing it is a measure that you can focus on. And then you can work on increasing the quality. We use a data observation system now that we collect. We perform inspections, and everybody across our project is required to participate in at least a weekly inspection. So now we're gathering that data. They're performing inspections, which is measurable. We have observations that need to be addressed and closed out. And through that, we can look at trends as well and measure those. Incident reporting, and are those being reported within a certain time period? Is there an event analysis or a learning team that conducts a meeting afterwards? What do you learn from that, and is that dispersed amongst the company to share those lessons? So those are things that we can all measure that gives us a better picture of how our system is performing.
Yeah, you hit on a couple of a couple of things there that were pretty good. That what you're basically talking about is a lot of activity measurements rather than, so they're more leading, obviously leading indicators rather than the lagging or the loss indicators. And it's more fair. One of the problems with the recordable incident rate to me has been the unfairness of it. Since it's so dependent upon how many man hours you work on any particular job or plant or project, it's not a statistically valid measurement. I know you and I have talked about that at great length, that it's not a statistically valid. We wouldn't use a measurement system in our organization to measure production that was not statistically valid. We wouldn't even think about doing that. So yes, we have to do that from the OSHA record keeping standpoint, but it should not be a good barometer for how our company is doing. Unfortunately, some of the owners out there use it as a barometer, although that's going away to some extent. One of the things I think that, I like your thoughts on that I think we've failed to do a good job of in safety is measuring costs rather than this nebulous, incident rate. Because people, especially in your end, well, in all industries, but management gets cost. And there have been so many times in a class full of safety people that I've asked the question, what was the total dollars cost for your company and workers' comp claims last year? And the vast majority of the room couldn't answer it. And then to make that even worse, go out and you ask supervision that question. Or in one case I can think of with a president of a construction company who in a meeting, it became clear that he did not understand that he was on a deductible program and that those costs were coming directly out of profit of the organization. So what do you think about talking cost?
Yeah, well, I think that's definitely a touchy subject when it comes to introducing these into a project in particular, the cost of injuries on that project. But I think it has to be just like any other metric that we would look at. I mean,
of course,
you're making decisions based on budgets and schedule and setting projections for the next year and how do we budget effectively. We need to know the cost to be able to do that. So I think that's definitely something that needs to be brought into more of the discussion. And even if a project isn't necessarily penalized directly for an incident that occurs on their project, it's still good to know what that impact could be. And of course, it makes it difficult in our field because a lot of times we're measuring things that didn't actually happen. So it's hard to quantify the number of injuries prevented or a fatality prevented. But by looking at life-altering events or potentially life-altering events or SIFs, we can look at how close we've come to possibly incurring those costs on the project. And of course, the last thing that we want is a fatality or anybody to sustain a life-altering injury.
Well, you're right. And you just hit on something. As safety professionals, we want the focus to be on the fact that we care about people and we don't, and that's awesome. And that's true. And that's what drives most of us, the best of us, to do what we do. But at the end of the day, by not talking, I think that sometimes we're not showing our worth, not only by talking about costs incurred, but also costs like you just hit on it, costs that could have been incurred, or were near hits, or reductions, especially if we go back over 3 years and we show that I know you have been a big, proponent on the leading edge of this, doing your best to move away from ladders and looking for alternative access points, and that if you can track the cost of ladder accidents for, a time period and then show a reduction in that cost later on, I think that resonates with management more so than talking about incident rates or whatever, or OSHA regulations.
Yeah, and the problem with incident rates is that, again, we've kind of beat this one to death, that we don't we don't like these metrics. But you can't compare, you can't even show any real improvement or change in your own company's performance if you're just looking at those numbers, because you're just quantifying the number, you're not quantifying the severity, and we can only do that through cost. So
that's right.
You have 3 injuries and the next year you have 10, and everybody says, oh my God, we're doing horrible, what went wrong? But those 3 first injuries could have been very significant, very costly injuries. And then the next year you have 10 that end up being minor, injuries, maybe some small lacerations, things that aren't very costly injuries and definitely not life altering. To me, that's a huge improvement in your system, and that's showing a real change in your performance. But if you look at just that incident rate, you won't be able to see that.
Absolutely. And I think that what that has done, and I know we're getting off the reporting here, but you just hit on something that's I'm pretty passionate about, and I've often, just last week, said to a group of safety professionals that I'm not particularly interested if you have 3 guys smash their thumb with a hammer in the past 30 days. And they were just flabbergasted by that. And I said, no, I'm a lot more interested that you almost had an arc flash event, so it changes that focus. But let's go back to the why won't people report for just a minute. You're right that it's almost human nature or just overall society culture that we don't want to admit when we've made a mistake. In fact, we might have told this story before, but I think it bears repeating. We had a bridge builder that we did work for, and a CEO had this large gong out in the lobby of their office, and Mike had gone out there to visit the CEO, and while he was waiting, he saw that gong, and he asked someone, he said, what's this gong here for? And they said, well, that's the CEO's idea. And he's like, for what? And they said, well, what he wants is that when someone makes a mistake, he wants them to come out and bang the gong, and then we'll all come out here and we'll all share what mistake we made. Well, I think he had great intentions, but then Mike said, well, how many times has anybody ever hit the gong? And she said, never. So the problem went back to your comment earlier about the organizational reaction. Apparently the organizational reaction was inhibiting that to some degree. So yes, people don't necessarily want to admit when they've made a mistake, but it's heavily dependent upon that organizational reaction, how comfortable they feel to make that statement, to make that. Now, I think a lot of times management doesn't know what they don't know. In other words, in our perception surveys and culture assessments, one of the questions we always ask management is, how free do you feel that workers are to report to you things that happen? I don't think we've ever had a case, or it was very rare, where management didn't say, oh, it's total, it's 100%, they'll tell you in a heartbeat. And yet you go in the same company and you go ask the workers and they go, we're not telling them unless we get caught. So how can there be such a disconnect? And that's what management perceives, that workers would tell them anything, but workers don't feel that way.
I think that this is in line with a lot of other safety messaging, that we have a problem getting the message all the way down. So you can have great messaging at the top. The leadership is 1,000% committed, and they pass that message down to their direct reports, and then they have to pass it down. And I know it's somewhere in that middle management level that it gets diluted. And then you have conflicting goals. So if that message about safety is not reinforced continuously and with the same importance as other goals, you're going to lose it. So if production is the main goal, and it's the one that is discussed and reinforced every single day, then taking the time to report is not going to take the same importance. So people are going to make decisions at the site level where their time needs to go. And actually that's a good segue into, I think, one of the other reasons that people don't report is time. Some incident reporting can take a lot of time, and it's difficult, and you have to go online and you have to print off this form, and if somebody perceives that as that's the first hurdle already, that it's too difficult for me to even fill out the report, they're not going to keep going and do the rest of the investigation. So we've tried to make that as painless as possible, and so we have an app on our phones that you can go right in and you can make a notification from your phone. It takes 10 seconds. We have digital forms that allow them to type that in directly from their computer. They don't have to worry about printing it off and scanning it. So just trying to reduce how much effort that takes. And if they know that it only takes a couple seconds, they can make the notification and then get the help that they need. They get an immediate response from somebody to help support them. That reinforces that that's a positive response from making the notification, making the report.
That is fantastic. It's just that, because you're right, we've got to remove the barriers to reporting. And that is one of the big barriers to reporting is the time and the cumbersomeness. The other one we've talked about, and that's management's reaction, the organizational's reaction. At the worker level, it's even harder sometimes to get that reporting. I know some folks have actually gone to an anonymous call number, 800 number, or something like that. Any thoughts on that, or do you see the same issues at the worker level?
We have implemented that type of thing on some of my larger projects, especially in the Middle East, where you want to give an opportunity for somebody to report. And we used to actually have a phone that was a dedicated line that people could call in. And that worked well because it was such a massive project and so many people. I mean, one project we had 30,000 plus people on it. So yes, we did use that type of system. I would say on the smaller projects, you really want to engage with the workforce. And the more you're talking to the workers and talking about how they're doing their job and what they need to do their job, that information is going to come. They want to be safe, I think, more than anybody on the job. And if we just talk to them enough, we'll find out the way things should be done, and we'll find out what they need to do the work safely.
No, you're 100% right there, that a lot of that is just face-to-face communication. And so you mentioned, like the blue vest walks, or basically what I call as field presence, just management getting out and getting in the field. But that's where you can learn that information, is by just talking to workers. Sometimes there's not. Also, you were talking about how things get lost, especially at that middle management level. It just seems, it starts from senior management. And I see this overwhelmingly, where senior management is so passionately committed to safety excellence. And then when they find out field realities of things that people are saying in the field at the worker level or foreman level, they're shocked and they're dismayed. And that reminds me of, and I know you're well familiar with this, but just for the audience, of the iceberg of ignorance of Sidney Yoshida's back in 89, I think it was, came up with this iceberg of ignorance. And I don't know if the numbers are 100% correct, but he's basically saying that senior management is only aware of about 4% of the actual field problems out there. And that number gets better as you get down to the worker level. But at the worker level, the workers have 100% knowledge of the problems. And so how do we bridge those gaps? Because you're right, senior management's vision gets lost on the way down if we don't break down those barriers somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that just comes from, continuously preaching your expectations and why, and really engaging with people all along the way. And then also asking, like, is there a conflict with these things that we're asking for? If we say, can we get this job done 1 week early? You have to talk about what are the conflicting goals to achieving that, and make sure that they have an opportunity to say that, yes, we can do that, but these are the resources that we need. This is why we can't do that. This is why we can't achieve that safely. We need to actually talk about it. We can't just assume that safety goes along with everything. We have to really reinforce that, and it has to go down each level, so that we're really instilling that same value down the line. And this is a little bit off on a tangent, but when we look at people and how they develop those values for safety, some people, it's just there. I would say that's probably fewer people than we'd like to think. I think a lot of people develop a value for safety because it becomes a condition of their employment. And that's through constantly reinforcing those expectations. And they either get on or they get off. And it might take a few years, but I've seen a lot of people truly develop a value for safety because it started as a condition of working, at a certain company, and it becomes habit. And they then start to truly value the benefit that safety has on their job.
Oh, you're 100% right there. I can think of people that I worked with, decades ago that were the worst when it came to safety, people in supervision. And then there was a management change or a cultural change within the organization. And it was, this is the way it's going to be now. And the next thing you know, they are like, the biggest, pushers of safety out there that you ever could imagine. And so you change people's values when the organization makes it clear what expectations are. Absolutely.
Right. And with expectations comes a set of metrics that you can measure, and you're reporting those.
Going back to your comment about when we have to cut a week off the schedule, or job not too long ago, it was like we're cutting 3 months off the schedule. That decision gets made usually between an owner and the senior management level. And most of the time, the conversation doesn't happen down at the level in which work occurs about what the cost of that will be, because there will be a cost. And that's, we use the term borrow from safety, from Rasmussen's model there, that when when you now have taken away time and resource, and time, you talked about how that's such a critical thing, is that you eat into people's time for reporting, and all that. But now if you cut that time off without coming up with how are we going to make that time up without borrowing from safety, then that's a real huge issue. So how do we get down to that where the work happens level to have those conversations? Or is that something you guys are talking about doing?
I think it's really engaging your pre-construction and even sales, business development right from the very beginning, and having them understand what your goals are out in the field and where are some of the common challenges that we have, and where, for example, in the budget, do we not include enough or for a certain item. It's very easy to say that we want stair towers on all of our jobs, but if it comes down to, okay, we need to get this estimate in within a certain number, that's a tangible item that you could take off early on. So we need to make sure that everybody really understands the non-negotiables and what that means if we start taking money out or squeezing the schedule early on. And again, having those conversations with the workforce, because they're going to feel pressure. They're going to feel pressure to do the job faster and with less resources. And they're out there just wanting to do the job. They come to work every day to do the job as well as they personally can do it, and as safe as they can feasibly do it with what they're given. And so it's really up to us to make sure that we're giving our workforce every opportunity to be able to do that job safely, and looking at quality as well. That's the other area that something's going to give in when you start crunching the schedule at the very end.
Well, that goes back to why I'm a bit of a fan about actual chargebacks to either projects or divisions, because the weight of the decision can get heavily balanced on cutting out things, but then it only takes a job or two before folks start to realize, well, if we cut the stair towers out and then we have this, then that also affects that overall profitability. So somehow we have to balance those decisions. But even back to, say we're going to, yes, you're right, you got hard bid jobs. It's easier to negotiated work. We agree with that. But with hard bid jobs, and that if you don't reach that certain number, you're not going to get the work. And without work, we have no company. So when we're making those decisions, though, I still think that sometimes they get made without input from people who either are actually actively, physically doing the work or have experience at doing in the work in the past. Because let's say, oh, well, we're going to add X number of people, and that might make sense at a senior level, but it may mean that, just extra people, we still don't have enough equipment. We still don't have enough scissor lifts to do the job. So that comes back to that, workers, know so much more, or, foreman level and so forth. They have so much information.
Yeah, and I think changing the use of the HSE department and how we can benefit projects. Helping people to understand that our value is not just out in the field watching people work and trying to prevent somebody from getting their finger caught between something. Our value is truly at the planning stages and getting a project set up and helping to set expectations, helping to communicate the requirements of everybody's roles, so that we don't get halfway through the project and we find out that, well, nobody told me that I needed to do an inspection every week. Nobody told me that I was using a subcontractor that had a bad incident rate or EMR, and that they should have been under some kind of special safety action plan. We need that information up front, and we need to go in with our eyes open as well. And I think that's the most important thing, is that when you make these decisions, it has to be communicated so the team understands what has been cut, how we're going to change our work or our processes to do this differently so that we can still maintain that safety. I've had a number of incidents in my past career that they were planned very well, and then a change was made. And that change didn't involve the people who had planned the activity in the first part. So then you get out there and you realize that the situation has changed, and then they just make do with what they've got. And we've had some pretty significant incidents because of that.
Sure.
You can track that back to, well, it wasn't just because he didn't tie off. It's because that you never were supposed to have to tie off, because everything was supposed to be completed and finished in this area, and they were supposed to have permanent guardrails.
So what you're basically describing is the changing role of HSE in organizations from the old day, which was our job was to be the police officers and to go out and beat people up, right? Catch them doing something wrong and write them up. And to the, kind of the new view, if you will, of HSE is that we are educators, we're technical resource, we're system analysts, we're planners, we measure performance, we all of those, the communicators, providing training and resources. And the good thing about that is that it's the reason I'm still in safety. If the change hadn't happened, I probably would have left the field. And I think you feel that way as well.
Yeah, and I think it gets better the more years that you're in this field, because you're gaining information and knowledge every single day.
Yes.
Every time something happens, you learn something new.
That's right.
And that's, I think, the most rewarding part of this for me, is to be able to discover something, and how can we do it differently, or how can we make it easier for the workers to do this and still be safe. And to discover that and share that amongst people, we're continuously improving, we're continuously learning. And to be able to have that experience within my career, I feel like it's that much more beneficial now that the safety culture is changing.
So to follow up on the word that you just used, that is a kind of a good, maybe start to wrap this conversation up, is you used the L word, learning. And so, and you talked about that, how critical it is that we learn from things. And so if we go back to why is where we started this conversation today, is why is reporting important? If we don't know about it, we can't learn. And we just live Groundhog Day over and over again. So anything else that you can share? That's some really good stuff, and you're doing some really good stuff out there. And you have been a good resource to me and to the rest of the safety community. So I very much appreciate you coming and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you. I look forward to doing it again.
Absolutely. Maybe that's a topic for next go around, is learning.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's go out there and save a life. And thanks again, Nicole.
Thanks, Pam.